Okay, so now that we've talked about the nervous system, how the nervous system actually communicates, and also the endocrine system, the second communication system in the body, now let's start talking about the central processing unit of kind of the entire show, so to speak, the brain. Okay, the brain weighs roughly 3 pounds, and interestingly enough, with the brain, is it's actually separated into two hemispheres, and it's actually connected together, the corpus callosum, which I will show in another slide here very soon. But before we get started in talking about the different structures and regions of the brain and what functions they're responsible for controlling, is that what we so far know about the brain, we understand to still be very limited in light of what we will probably continue to find out about the brain. What we do know is that the brain is probably one of the most complex organs known to mankind, and it's a very specialized information processing machine, so to speak. Because there's a lot of things that, as humans we can do. We can take in visual information, we can take in sound information, all sorts of different sensory information, and actually incorporate all those different sensory channels into just one unique experience, that is our consciousness. But when we actually try to, research, well, where in the brain are these specific functions actually located, we come to find out that very rarely do any single function of consciousness or thinking or memory seems to respond or correspond to only one specific brain site. Oftentimes, for many of our skills and many psychological processes, such as our emotional experiences, the experience of dreams, is that they involve multiple regions and structures of the brain communicating with one another. So since we're talking about the brain communicating within itself, the brain is a very highly linked up system. Many different regions of the brain have, several thousand connections, across the entire brain. And we call these neural pathways. And what they actually are, physically what they are, they're bundles of those myelinated neurons, again, that myelin sheath. And if I were to actually take a human brain and set it down on the table, and I'm looking directly down at it, and I cut a little chunk out from the crown of the brain, this is what it would look like. And what you can see here are these nerve pathways, and this right here is the corpus callosum, one of the most important neural pathways that actually connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Because your brain, in a sort of way, you can think about them as being kind of like two computers. But in order for those two computers to link up and talk to one another, there has to be some type of physical connection between them, typically. But otherwise, they're two perfectly functioning computers that specialize in slightly different functions. So the left hemisphere specializes in certain functions that the right hemisphere doesn't necessarily specialize in, but it specializes in its own special functions. So what these neural pathways do is they really allow the brain to communicate with itself from very distant regions of of itself. And also, if the brain has more neural pathways, we can also have more complex experiences, because we can incorporate more brain regions into the process of interpreting our experiences. So this is one reason you might hear, humans being as advanced as they are. One contributing factor is the fact that we just have a very highly linked up system. Another characteristic of the brain, and this gets back to this nature versus nurture controversy that you might remember me discussing from the first week, is that human beings, we have a genetic code, and our biological development will unfold in as the genetic code dictates. But the brain especially is very much molded by its experiences, and this concept that I'm talking about is neuroplasticity. And oftentimes we just refer to it as plasticity in neuroscience research. But Plastic, as you know, a substance, the reason why plastic is particularly wonderful is that it can be molded into pretty much any shape we want it to mold into. But if I need to, say for example, if I have an empty, plastic milk carton, it has a certain shape, and if I need to throw it away, I crumple it up and, toss it into the trash, okay, because I don't want a very big, obnoxious milk jug and taking up a lot of, valuable real estate in my trash bin. But if I were to, for some reason, say I did really want to keep that milk jug after all, I guess because maybe I'm a hoarder, if I was patient enough, I could pop that milk jug relatively back into its original shape. Yeah, it'll have some dings, but that's sort of the new experience that it's had, and that's kind of the analogy I'm making here with the brain, and that, yes, it is a physical structure, or a set of physical structures in this organ, but it is very much molded. The way neurons link up with one another, the way different brain regions link up with one another, is very much shaped by the experiences that we have in life. And for example, somebody who is very skilled in ballet, a skill that I do not possess, has, a slightly different, brain structure based on that experience that I don't necessarily have, because I did not spend many years refining this very, very precise kinesthetic ability. So that is the concept of neuroplasticity. Okay, so now we're going to actually start talking about the various structures of the brain. Before we start talking about the different structures of the brain, it's important to know that the brain is ordered in a sort of hierarchy. There are different levels, and this is known as the hindbrain, the midbrain, and then the forebrain. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the structures located in the hindbrain, and the reason it's called the hindbrain is because it's located in the back and behind the brain, so it's the hindbrain. Now this is the base region of the brain. It connects the brain to the spinal cord proper, and it's actually the oldest region of the brain in human evolutionary history, and is also one of the first regions of the brain to start developing during the prenatal period before we come into the world. And so since it's the oldest region of the brain, it is actually responsible for controlling the most basic life functions. So the first structure of the hindbrain is the medulla. The long name is medulla oblongata, in case anybody has ever actually heard that. But its function is to control all vital life processes, all autonomic functions such as your breathing and your heart rate, digestion, and particularly reflexes such as swallowing and sneezing, coughing, vomiting, shivering. And if there were damage done to the medulla oblongata, then you would literally stop living. You would die. Okay? And there would be no coming back. Without the medulla, the body cannot function. The next structure of the hindbrain are the pons. That is actually Latin for bridge. And so for those of you who are already somewhat familiar, especially if you know somebody who's experienced a stroke, is that the body is contralaterally organized. Okay? And what that means, contra means opposite, and laterally means side. So it's literally opposite-sided, meaning that the right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your body and all functions performed on the left side of the body, while the left hemisphere of the brain actually controls all functions on the right side of the body. So a person who has experienced a stroke, say, and brain damage in the right hemisphere of their brain, will experience symptoms on the left side of the body. Okay, and so the pons is the site at which information from the two different sides of the body actually crosses over to go to their hemisphere. Okay, and that's why we refer to it as the bridge. And so ultimately, in terms of its function, it helps coordinate and integrate your movements on each side of the body, so you can do something, say, such as walk across the street. That involves integration of both information from the left and right side of the body, and the pons allows that to happen. The next structure of the brain is the reticular formation. In other general psychology textbooks, it may be called the reticular activating system, but it's really an either-or, tomato situation. This particular structure, the hindbrain, is actually a specialized bundle of neurons, a few different bundles of neurons that actually come up here from the brain stem and actually extend all the way up into the higher brain regions, up out into the cerebral cortex, actually the forebrain. And what it does is it acts as both kind of an attentional filter, which helps us focus our attention, and it also plays a very important role in the sleep and wake process. Okay, so it plays a very important role in arousal. So, for example, oftentimes, especially if you've been sitting here listening to this lecture for a while, you may have forgotten about how maybe you're starting to feel a little bit numb in your bottom or in your legs because you haven't shifted or moved around in a little while. And it's not that your brain stops processing that information that's coming in from your body, this touch and pressure information we're receiving. It's just that when you are focused on another activity, such as example, listening to lecture, taking notes, is that the brain or the reticular formation filters out this unnecessary information, so you can focus on what is the necessary information. Because at any given time we are taking in thousands of different sources of stimuli and information from our environment, and not all sources are very important. People who suffer from attentional disorders certainly know what it's like to be unable to focus their attention because there are too many competing sources of information that are demanding their attention. The next structure of the hindbrain is the cerebellum, and it is this part that hangs off the back side of the brain. It actually hangs down and under the brain. And cerebellum is actually Latin for little brain, because there is actually an astounding number of neurons in this tiny brain within a brain, so to speak. But what the cerebellum does in terms of its function is it helps control your motor coordination and movement, and your precision in movement, and your accuracy in timing your movements, so you don't do something like, say, accidentally stumble over your feet. And so damage to this area can cause any number of motor disorders. And now that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who has a damaged cerebellum can never walk again, but if somebody had a damaged cerebellum, say for example a hand balancer, while she could still continue to try to walk and move around, she would be very wobbly, she would lose her sense of balance, and she would have a very difficult time doing what she does. Another thing that I like to think about when I'm trying to remember the functions of the different brain structures with the cerebellum, I tend to think about people who are very kinesthetically gifted, dancers and athletes and hand balancers alike, that if they had damage to this region of the brain, it would certainly make watching their performances a lot more interesting, and probably would end up on one of those America's Funniest Home Videos. So that concludes the hindbrain. Now the next subregion of the brain, the midbrain, there's not a whole lot I want to say about it, and you don't have to particularly concern yourself with this for the exam, but the midbrain, it's actually a relay station for auditory and visual information. The one structure that it has that's very important is the substantia nigra, is because the reason it's important is because it is involved in motor control and contains a large amount of dopamine producing neurons. This is the structure that is particularly damaged in Parkinson's disease, and that's why it contributes to a number of the physical symptoms of the disease.